Hey everybody, this is Jeff. I wanted to go live tonight. I just read something. It made me think of my grandpa. And I'd like to read it to you. If I have your permission, your blessing, I'd like to read something to you. And it's on Facebook, I know that. But it's something that, I don't know, it struck me and I really enjoyed it. And if you are okay with it, I am going to read it to you. A lot of us know about the comic growing up, Calvin and Hobbes. And anyway, it was always a good Sunday cartoon in the paper. Anyway, I'll put it on my Facebook page, but I'm reading it from somebody else's right now. But I'm going to read this. For some reason, I want to read this to everybody. Not for any other reason than just to read it. And it's showing Calvin and Hobbes in the tree. You know, Hobbes is the tiger, of course, and Calvin is the little boy. And it's stated, in the final minutes of his life, Calvin has one last talk with Hobbes. And it goes as follows, if I have your permission to read it. Calvin, sweetheart. In the darkness, Calvin heard the sound of Susie, his wife of 53 years. Calvin struggled to open his eyes. God, he was so tired and it took so much strength. Slowly, light replaced the darkness and soon vision followed. At the foot of his bed stood his wife. Calvin wet his dry lips and spoke hoarsely. Did you find him? Yes, dear, Susie said, smiling sadly. He was in the attic. Susie reached into her big purse and brought out a soft, old orange tiger doll. Calvin could not help but laugh. It had been so long. Too long. I washed him for you, Susie said. Her voice crackled a little as she laid the stuffed tiger next to her husband. Thank you, Susie, Calvin said. A few moments passed as Calvin just laid on his hospital bed, his head turned to the side, staring at the old toy with nostalgia. Dear Calvin said finally, would you mind leaving me alone with Hobbes for a while? I would like to catch up with him. All right, Susie said. I'll get something to eat in the cafeteria. I'll be back soon. Susie kissed her husband on the forehead and turned to leave. With sudden but gentle strength, Calvin stopped her. Lovingly, he pulled his wife in and gave her a passionate kiss on the lips. I love you, he said. And I love you, said Susie. Susie turned and left. Calvin saw tears streaming from her face as she went out the door. Calvin then turned to face his oldest and dearest friend. Hello, Hobbes. It's been a long time, hasn't it, old pal? Hobbes was no longer a stuffed owl, but the big furry old tiger Calvin had always remembered. It sure has, Calvin, said Hobbes. You haven't changed a bit, Calvin smiled. You've changed a lot, Hobbes said sadly. Calvin laughed. Really? I haven't noticed at all. There was a long pause. The sound of the clock ticking away, the second rang throughout the sterile hospital room. So you married Susie Durkins, Hobbes said, finally smiling. I knew you always liked her. Shut up, Calvin said, his smile bigger than ever. Tell me something I've missed. I'd love to hear what you've been up to, Hobbes said, excited. And so Calvin told him everything. He told him about how he and Susie fell in love in high school and had married after graduating from college, about his 3 kids and 4 grandkids, how he turned Spaceman Spiff into one of the most popular sci-fi novels of the decade, and so on. After he told Hobbes all this, there was another pregnant pause. You know, I visited you in the attic a bunch of times, Calvin said. I know, but I couldn't see you. All I saw was a stuffed animal. Calvin's voice was all breaking and tears of regret started welling up in his eyes. You grew old buddy, said Hobbes. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I broke my promise. I promised I wouldn't grow up and that we'd be together forever. Calvin broke down and sobbed, hugged his best friend. Hobbes stroked Calvin's hair and what little was left of it. But you didn't. What do you mean? We were always together in our dreams. We were? We were. Hobbs. Yeah, old buddy, I'm so glad I got to see you like this one last time. Me too, Calvin. Me too. Sweetheart. Susie's voice came from outside the door. Yes, dear, Calvin replied. Can I come in? Susie asked. Just a minute. Calvin turned to face Hobbs one last time. Goodbye, Hobbs. Thanks for everything. No, thank you, Calvin, Hobbs said. Calvin turned back to the door and said, You can come in now. Susie came in and said, Look who's come to visit. Calvin's children and grandchildren followed Susie into the room. The youngest grandchild ran past the rest of them and hugged Calvin in a hard, excited hug. Grandpa! Screamed the child in delight. Francis! Cried Calvin's daughter. Be gentle with your grandfather. Calvin's daughter turned to her dad. I'm sorry, Dad. Francis never seems to behave these days. He just runs around making a mess and coming up with strange stories. Calvin laughed and said, Well now, that sounds just like me when I was his age. Calvin and his family chatted some more until the nurse said, Sorry, but visiting hours are almost up. Calvin's beloved family said goodbye and promised to visit tomorrow. As they turned to leave, Calvin said, Francis, come here for a second. Francis came over to Grandfather's side. What is it, Gramps? Calvin reached over to the stuffed tiger on his bed beside and held him out shakingly to his grandson, who looked exactly as he did so many years ago. This is Hobbs. He was my best friend when I was your age. I want you to have him. He's just a stuffed tiger, Francis said, eyebrows raised. Calvin laughed. Well, let me tell you a secret. Francis leaned closer to Calvin. Calvin whispered, If you catch him in a tiger trap using a tuna sandwich as bait, he will turn into a real tiger. Francis gasped in delight, awe. Calvin continued, Not only that, he will be your best friend forever. Wow, thanks, Grandpa, Francis said, hugging his grandpa tightly again. Francis, we need to go now, Calvin's daughter called. Okay, Francis shouted back. Take good care of him, Calvin said. I will, Francis said before running off after the rest of the family. Calvin laid on his back and stared at the ceiling. The time to go was close. He could feel it in his soul. Calvin tried to remember a quote he had read in a book once. It said something about death being the next great adventure, or something like that. His eyelids grew heavy and his breathing slowed. As he went deeper into his final sleep, he heard Hobbs, as if he were right next to him at his bedside. I'll take care of him, Calvin. Calvin took his first step toward one more adventure and breathed his last with a grin on his face. It's funny how as we get older, we reminisce about being a kid. As we're kids, we want to be older. It's a good story.